welcome to Music with the Maestro. I'm Anthony Blake Clark, Music Director of Baltimore Choral Arts, and I have the great privilege of being with Teddy Abrams today. Teddy Abrams is the Music Director of the Louisville Symphony Orchestra, and we met last year. I got to cover conduct for him at the National Symphony, and I'm really hoping I can work with you again sometime. I hope that happens soon after all this nonsense is over and we can get out of our houses.
Well, that was such a great project that we all did. It was so fun. That was one of the most outrageous weeks I think I've ever been a part of.
You were busy. You were very busy.
Two programs, one world premiere that had been finished 4 days before the first rehearsal. Giant film glass piece. It was just incredible.
Absolutely amazing. Yeah, for sure. So, what have you been doing to fill your time now that we are not rehearsing or performing?
Well, I have been trying to stay creative and connected to various storylines that are going on right now, which evolve and change faster than I think we can all understand. And especially as artists, it's funny, artists move really fast and they're on top of the things that are changing in society, but arts organizations move really slowly and they're behind all the changes that are happening. So it's very weird to have both of those two kind of hats that I feel like I'm always changing them. Like here, I feel like an artist that wants to get on the front edge. I want to, change this and get involved in civic work or come up with the most creative, innovative ideas to fight the pandemic, whatever that kind of artist mentality is. And then you also have this whole thing of, oh my God, we got to bring X $1 million organization along with us and change rules and regulations and mentalities that have been stuck for decades now. And I feel like those are two contrasting roles that we have to figure out how to balance. But this is not a slow moving world right now. This is the fastest. I feel like it's only accelerating. And it means that honestly, a lot of the approaches that large organizations have often taken to, get slow buy-in, change things very calmly, try a little thing, and then walk backwards, see if it worked. That just doesn't work in our society right now, given the massive upheaval that we're witnessing. And so anyway, to answer your actual question, I pretty much when the pandemic started, I had one day where I thought, well, this is going to be fun. I'm going to have all this time. I could get all these, maybe more personal creative projects done that I've wanted to do. And then the mayor of our city called. We're lucky in Louisville that we have a really close connection between the mayor, the mayor's office, metro government, and the orchestra. Kind of very, very unusually, I would say, would you find something that tight knit. And he asked me to help lead a program called Lift Up Lou, which was more of a cultural program to keep spirits positive, to keep the community connected, to fight social isolation, and just try a ton of different ideas. So of course, my theory is if somebody ever thinks of the arts as being a part of a solution to a civic problem, you just say yes and do it. So I was very happy to do so, and then that's kept us busy for a while.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that. So we are, just to give the audience a little bit of a hint of what we're going to talk about, we are having an orchestra-only day, which is going to be a nice sort of refreshing experience. But before we sort of pivot only to talking about orchestra music, I was just wondering, Teddy, how do you approach working with a choir that might be different than when only the orchestra is on stage? So when you add the extra element of a symphony chorus, and it may not belong to the symphony that you're working with. It might be an independent organization with different structures and different personalities. How do you combine those works on stage?
Well, I found it, first of all, I always say, I found working with singers and especially choirs to be the most fun because generally they are so enthusiastic to be a part of any orchestral collaboration. And the attitude is almost universally positive. Let's just face it, the orchestral world is not known for being the most friendly work environment. I think we can safely say that publicly. And that's nobody's fault. It's just how things have come to be. But orchestras are tough. They're famously tough on conductors and famously tough on young conductors. And that's something that every conductor has to navigate because you're dealing with, whatever it is, somewhere between 60 and 100 people who have very strong opinions about how orchestral music should be approached, how it should sound, how rehearsals should be run, and how their time should be spent.
And they have a broad range of experience that allows them that opinion.
Yes, and they're not wrong for it, but it's very hard given the way we've set up the whole system for rehearsals universally, regardless of what the repertoire is. First of all, that makes no sense at all and should be changed. I'm not, again, I feel like, what do I have to lose by saying things that I think most people understand to be truths, but nobody's wanted to really talk about. But you have 4 rehearsals to get to know, in many cases, an entire body of strangers, an entire group of people who are experts in performing at an extremely high level, but who often range from first year in the orchestra, 23 years old, to 40th year in the orchestra, and suddenly this person has to develop a full rapport and work with them in a matter of sometimes 2.5 days, 4 rehearsals, and that's nuts. First of all. But with choirs, I've almost always found that everybody's so excited about just the prospect of making this music, and there's almost always a culture of, oh, let's see what this person's perspective. This is so exciting, a new person we get to meet, and I don't know why that is, but it actually is something I love working with, because you get that kind of positive energy feed, which is really nice, and I guess the thing I like to do with choirs is that, I think that a lot of times as an orchestral conductor, we spend so much time thinking about the philosophy, the subtext, all these things that you actually can't even address in the rehearsals because there isn't time. You can't, and also the orchestral musicians often don't want to hear, a long-winded speech, your philosophies about this particular chord, or why that suspension is so meaningful, or this, that one poignant element and how it connected with Stravinsky. They don't want to hear that. But I find that a lot of times choirs are open to that kind of conversation, like more of a discussion about why and what and how, not just execution. And so I love working with choirs because I actually get to feel like, okay, let's get into this. Let's delve deeper. It's a little more like working with actors or something in a way. And so I find that super gratifying. So many of the pieces that call for choir and orchestra also are some of the most dramatic works, where you will often feel more like you're marshalling. You feel more like somewhere in between, like, I don't know, D.W. Griffith or Martin Scorsese marshalling, like a huge giant set, or like a general. It's really fun. I mean, just trying to get the scope of it to unify. That's a really fun feeling.
Right. Well, I'm glad that you are so excited about choral music. We are too.
I love it.
But to pivot to what we're actually talking about today, we're going to talk about Copland and Gershwin. The 2 pieces I think that we're delving into are Appalachian Spring and Rhapsody in Blue. So, I mean, though these different works sort of display a really contrasting sound world, they each in their way exhibit a very sort of American sound. So I'm wondering, besides that, why you chose to talk about these 2 things today.
Well, it was also in light of everything going on around us, which of course, and I don't know when people are seeing this, but we are now about a week in to the protests and the unrest resulting from George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others. And of course, thinking about our role in our specific world, which has the reputation and the stereotype, not always correct, but certainly has the reputation and stereotype of often being the most rarefied, most kind of cut off from modern populist culture. When people think of orchestras and they're not familiar with what we really do and what musicians in these orchestras really believe and are capable of, they often think of exactly the worst kind of stereotypes, the 19th century BBC kind of British Tea Party, where they have a string quartet playing completely innocuous, irrelevant, off to the side music. Like that image is seared in people's heads, and media, mainstream media, has only propagated that. Long way of saying, I was thinking about what of course we're supposed to do. How are we going to step up as leaders rather than being out on the sidelines like we almost always are during a period when the country is growing? You think about the power of music in previous major upheavals. and we often sit it out and we wait for others to actually do the kind of work that activates change. And I don't want to do that. And so when you asked about the repertoire, I started thinking about, Gershwin and Copland, who are two, obviously, white composers, and both dead, which represents a lot of the music that we play, because there is a lot of great music written by dead white people. It's true. But both of these composers were people that understood the American story in a broader sense and I don't even know if anybody ever explained this to them. I think it's just in part by their upbringing, part by their background, both being Jewish composers who grew up in an urban, diverse area.
Yeah.
But I think they both understood intuitively that music it definitely had cultural associations, but actually doesn't have boundaries. And they understood that if they were to represent the country in a way that was unifying, then they would have to reach beyond the narrow bounds of what we are expected to do in our lanes, and write the music that we really wanted to write. And the music that they really wanted to write, at least in part of their careers, in Copland's case, drew on music that generally people couldn't have accessed before, not in such an obvious and overt way. And this is all a very long way of saying that I think they represent the very best of what's possible in this country when it comes to a composer that says, we're going to break down barriers by not having barriers in our music. We're going to write music that truly can belong to everybody, even if it's not within our power to make everybody listen to it. The music itself belongs to all. And I mean, I think that there's never been a better example of seeing that beautiful cycle of everybody finding their voice than in Gershwin, where you got, again, this kind of nerdy looking Jewish composer who's written music that drew on the Black experience, and he openly admitted, even if there's a little bit of discussion on that, but openly admitted to that love of music that came from Black culture, filtered through his own genius. We can't, absolutely cannot leave out Gershwin's own brilliance in interpreting this and in putting it through a filter that allows us as orchestral musicians and organizations to play this, and then reimagined by generations of singers and instrumentalists in every possible genre and every single possible background, including many of the people that originally inspired him to write the music in the first place in the Black community, it's a beautiful, beautiful picture. And it's the cultural picture that often gets left off from just the story of a specific piece, or just the story of one part of Gershwin's life.
Right. If you sort of look at the whole with Porgy and Bess and Rhapsody in Blue, it sort of it speaks to sort of that borrowing with respect and distilling some elements of different kinds of music into Gershwin's idiom and into the classical music sort of space. I think it's really cool.
That's exactly right. And I think in Gershwin's case, he really grew up playing both kinds of music, and he was such a central figure in mainstream music, but also had this deep understanding of the power of kind of written down classical music, whatever you might call that. I mean, he was attracted to both equally, and I think it is, it's really fascinating that somehow that didn't stop him. It didn't force him to write in one genre or the other. That he really understood that those things could be combined. And I think it's always that question of when somebody is a trailblazer or somebody tries something new, there's obviously instances of inspiration. You look at Scott Joplin, who was, writing full-on operas, writing out every single note in his, ragtime music. But Gershwin was equally inspired by both the ragtime genre and the, up-and-coming genuine jazz genre, which was, a very, very different kind of music. And how he, figured out how to combine these two things can only be explained as an expression of authenticity. It wasn't a gimmick with him. It wasn't something that he did as a stunt. It wasn't part of, stunt dynamics. It was a natural expression, I think, of who he was. And Copland did not approach that same kind of systematic use of popular music in the same way. Copland didn't grow up playing fiddle tunes. Nothing could be farther from Copland's upbringing. And of course, he was a genuine avant-garde composer for the first stage of his career. Not an atonal composer, but an avant-garde composer. But he looked at it from a very different perspective. He, unlike Gershwin, who I think Gershwin was just natural with this. He was naturally synthesizing the jazz idiom with the classical idiom. Copland, on the other hand, made a conscious decision to say, wait a minute, people aren't understanding the music that I'm writing, and so many other composers are writing right now. It's not working if we're to have a populist voice, which is completely connected to the American story. I'm quite sure that if Copland hadn't lived in that specific time period, the second part of the Depression, the beginning of the WPA program, the Federal Music Project, all these other, populist initiatives leading into World War II, he wouldn't have had the same realization, which was that at a time like that, people didn't necessarily need more inexplicable avant-garde music that didn't really reach broad audiences. There was a specific decision that he made to say, wait a minute, if we're to rally American spirit, we're going to have to make a serious decision about what this music sounds like, an aesthetic decision. And that's exactly what he did. It was very conscious.
Sure. Well, while we're still talking about Gershwin, let's pivot to Rhapsody in Blue. So there was a premiere that was given in 1924, and it was much anticipated concert in New York City. I was reading about this last week in anticipation of our conversation. I am shocked and floored and surprised, and I wish I could have been there because Stravinsky was there, Rachmaninoff was there, Tchaikovsky was there, John Philip Sousa was there. What was going on?
Well, it was also an endless concert. I think it was like it rivaled Beethoven's famous, 3-hour. The Fifth Symphony, the Sixth Symphony, and the Choral Fantasy, all those things in the same program. It was kind of like that. And the project was called, it was like the experimental concert, where the whole thing was about trying to explore the connections between jazz and classical music. And I think Gershwin was second to last or something like that when he did the Rhapsody in Blue finally. And of course, people went nuts. What's interesting is that it is important to remember that there were a lot of other composers that were directly inspired, of course, by the jazz idiom, but didn't have the fluency that Gershwin had. And if you look at his upbringing, he was writing songs for the Follies, all the great early Broadway productions, both the kind of compendium productions that were going on, the variety shows, and actual musicals, and that was a combination of kind of like Yiddish theater and jazz itself, and British popular song, things like that, all fused together in that genre. But of course, in this case, he really was writing a piano concerto for a jazz band. It wasn't, the orchestral version came later, but it wasn't just another classical piece. It was a written out jazz-y work for a jazz ensemble that specialized in playing big band music, which we have to remember too, that at that time, it wasn't like, the bebop kind of improvisation that we think of when we say the word jazz. Much of the swing and big band era involved orchestras playing written out music, small solos. Even Benny Goodman, when you listen to his solos, over the even years, would be playing very similar things. It wasn't as improvisatory as we expect right now when we go hear, like somebody like, Corey Henry soloing on organ like that, truly just coming out of, the ether. That wasn't quite the aesthetic. It was a different kind of work. And also, there was a really interesting racial element to it, that you did have white and black big bands, and you add white and black band leaders. Sometimes they would have people of all backgrounds in them, but a lot of times there were clear delineations, not only where they could play, but who could join the groups. It was a very interesting era. Anyway, this is a very long way of saying that this concert was fascinating. I think people talked about it being absolutely exhausting too, like truly exhausting. And then Gershwin got up and played, and that must have been one of the great moments in American musical history.
Absolutely.
To hear that for the first time.
Wish I could have been there for sure.
Yeah.
I think we should probably just listen to a little bit of it. Is there a specific moment that you want to talk about? before we let our audience listen in?
Well, I've done the Rhapsody in Blue a number of times in a number of ways. I've conducted it and somebody else has played the piano. I've played the piano and somebody else has conducted, and I have played and conducted it at the same time. And I mean, the other weird thing is I'm also a clarinetist, so I've also played the clarinet solo at the beginning. So this is like my piece. I love this thing, and it's amazing how it's been co-opted by United Airlines, and it's been used in so many absurd ways, but it never gets old. I think that moment when you first hear the clarinet come in with the trill, of course, everybody on the planet knows what piece is about to start as soon as you hear that one
Something's
trill.
coming, right?
And for me, because I play the clarinet and because I've had this long relationship with the piece in so many different ways, there's a thrill that comes from knowing that glissando, that slide that the clarinet plays, the most famous slide in history, is incredibly tough to do. And we've all heard it flop. we've all heard a clarinet not quite make it, or squawk, or something like that. We all or have it tough to get going. It's very hard to do, especially for an orchestral clarinet player. I could tell you why, but that's maybe too detailed. It's the strength of the reeds and it's an approach to embouchure that we don't use. There you go. But there's a moment of, oh my God, what's going to happen? How's this one going to go? I love that. It's a thrill that comes from that. And maybe that's a bit of an insider, but I always sit there going, oh my God, what gliss is this going to be? And when it's really good, it's one of the most, I think that's just one of the most fulfilling things to hear. Yeah.
Really amazing stuff. And it's funny that we're talking about both of these compositions today because they have some similarities, right? So we hear the variations and the treatment of this theme in variations by Gershwin, and Copland sort of does the same thing in a couple of spots in the Appalachian Spring Suite. And of course, they both kind of exist as cornerstones in 20th century American music. Do you find any other similarities to them as we transition to Copland and Appalachian Spring?
Well, what's interesting is they both have different versions associated with them. In the Gershwin situation, you have the jazz band version, you have the full version with the full orchestra, the orchestration that he worked on with some help, and also You have versions with cuts. A lot of people do all kinds of cuts. There are like 4 or 5 different cut options in it. Most people don't take those anymore. But actually, I mean, even Bernstein recorded the version with a whole bunch of cuts. It's about 4 minutes shorter.
Wow.
And so you've got all kinds of different options there. And then, and also the solo piano version, not to mention the 2 piano version. And the same thing with Appalachian Spring, which has many different versions associated with it.
Like 4 or 5, right?
Yeah, you have a 13 instrument version, of course, for the full ballet.
Yes.
That came initially. And then you have the full orchestration of the full ballet. That's almost never heard. Either one is never heard. And then you have about 2 different suite versions. There's a suite that is the most commonly played one for the full orchestra that runs, about 24
minutes, yeah.
And then the same thing for the 13 instruments, the exact same format, just with a smaller instrumentation. And
Right.
then there's a version that I've also done, which is essentially the suite, but with a large chunk of music. There's only one big cut between the suite and the full version. Other things are just kind of like moments for the ballet where it's a repeated bar.
It's choreography or something. Yeah.
Exactly. It's mostly for the choreography, but there is a chunk of 5 minutes that was cut out of the music for the suite. And it's by far the darkest, most turbulent section of the music. It doesn't sound like the rest of it. And that I've talked with a lot of folks about why that was cut out. It's, it's very, very interesting. The suite kind of, evocative, picturesque, so-called Appalachian Spring, even though that's not what it was about, but Appalachian Spring that people hear and see every time they encounter this music is in stark contrast to the 5 minutes that was cut out. It comes actually in the middle of the variations. Mm-hmm. So you know how in the suite, there's that moment the variations have been going, and the very last variation is a big giant statement of the Simple Gifts theme, right? Simple Gifts comes, you play Simple Gifts over and over. There's a nice one with the piano, the nice one with the brass, the fast strings, whatever. The last one is the big giant fully unified one. In the full version of this piece, it doesn't go straight into that last variation. And it's weird because I always thought to myself before I encountered the full or the full version, the original ballet length, it just feels like it's a little bit of an empty victory to get that big last joyous variation. It comes early. And in fact, that's the case. It truly does come early because in the full version, there's this long, turbulent, really tough, much more dissonant whole expose. And it's a big, important part in the ballet's plot, which is a nebulous and abstract plot to begin with, but it's a very important part of the dramatic action.
Right.
And then the very last bit is it comes out of this turbulent thing and you get the final variation, which has been delayed now for 5 minutes, and it feels like you've earned it. And
that's amazing. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that it was a huge aha moment. And ever since I've encountered that rest of that, I can't hear it without it. It just doesn't work because it's not, it doesn't speak to the ethos, and it honestly, it doesn't speak to the moment in history that Copland was writing this. It makes sense that given 1943 and 1944, this music would have more than just, a kind of, nice, lovely rolling spirit, which so much of it does have this kind of pastoral quality, but that's not the complete picture.
So I certainly wasn't planning to listen to this moment, but I think we absolutely should listen to that because we certainly don't hear it every day because we usually hear the suite. So let's listen to that really quickly. Copeland really shows great breadth in the way he conveys the American sentiment musically. I mean, on the one hand, in this piece, you've got these big, massive, sweeping pastorals, and then also some sort of rodeo-style galloping themes. But then at the end of the piece, he just turns on a dime and gives you sort of the return of that really delicate and tender, intimate music. It's really incredible, and it's very emotional. And it sort of really does sort of convey many different sentiments of the American musical idiom. And how do you think he achieves that?
I think he achieves it by being honest. And in an age when people are so ready to point out appropriation and so ready to point out the kind of expectations that come with using music or art or even speech that isn't connected to your specific story. Copeland avoids that, even though you can discuss the origins of that music, but Copeland avoids people somehow denigrating him for that usage because it's authentic and it's genuine and it's honest. And he's not using simple gifts so much as including simple gifts. And I think that's a very important thing. It's not just simple gifts, it's the use of things that reference all kinds of American musical traditions, cowboy songs, prairie tunes, folk songs, church hymns, things like that are not so much appropriated as even beyond interpreted. I think they're internalized. And he understood that, just like Charles Ives did in a very different way, but they understood that to communicate with this country, you have to recognize that the culture that we've produced has a direct link to our sense of identity, our sense of history, our sense of differences, and maybe in the most important case, our sense of appreciation for those differences. There is no better example of Americans understanding different cultures than through our art. It's the place where there's been genuine appreciation for the other, whatever that is. And I think Copeland intuited that. And that's why it's so honest, because that's who he was as a person. Copeland was a very liberal, very progressive, combination of elements, being a New Yorker, Jewish gay man, almost communist, that I think, he understood that for a person with his sensibilities and his background to be able to communicate with an American in the middle of the country that had never seen somebody like him or met somebody like him, music in a broad sense would be the way to do it.
Right.
And there's that, again, that's who he was as a person, and it comes through in the music. And that's why when he takes a prairie tune, or he takes a cowboy song, or he takes a black railroad workers song and uses it in one of the great populist ballets that he's written, it doesn't seem like appropriation. It's using it for the inspiration and the potential to communicate, which was the original purpose of the art in the first place. That's a very long way of saying that's why it works. And that's why you don't listen to Copeland and go, oh, that's just pastiche. Oh, that's some kind of collage of other people's stuff. It's not. And I think that's because all of those elements are folded in like ingredients. None of them are, they're not arrangements of something. They're genuinely folded in as an ingredient. I don't know what I'm thinking of here, but if you're making a Reese's Pieces cookie, you can probably still tell they're Reese's Pieces, but if you've done it really well, it's just going to be a great cookie. I don't know. That's a weird image for it, but you probably get my sense. He didn't try and mush it up, but he also didn't just put a giant Reese's Pieces thing and say it was his. That's my weird analogy for it, but that's the authenticity. And of course, in Appalachian Spring, the way the piece starts and closes, that's not using anything other than his own voice. That incredible use of the two stacked triads, that incredible sense, what he calls it, the white sound, which not a racial white, but like this, he wants
white
the clarinet
tone
to make a sound that is, like you're almost looking at the sun in the morning or something like that, and it's just, you can't even tell where the blue skies or anything, like it's just so crystalline and perfect. And just imagine America at that time. Like this must have played so deeply into the psyche of people that had this bucolic sense of America, but also this sense of loss and this sense of now being in an international environment that many people didn't understand, and to see that what was a pure expression from an artist like that, it must have been both very, very comforting and very connecting.
That's amazing. Really great insight. I'm so glad that we got to talk about this. Maybe the most poignant way to end would be just to listen to that that ending.
Yes.
But we'll leave our audience with that. But thank you, Teddy Abrams, so much for joining me. It's been a real honor and privilege to talk about this music that you have a lot of a breadth, huge experience with. And I'm sure that you learned a lot of this from your mentors as well. So we also thank them. But thank you so much for joining me. I hope I'll see you again soon. And thanks for taking the time out. And don't forget to join us next week, everyone. Same time, same place, Thursdays at 5:45. So here is some Copeland to end.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.